On the 7th of April, the Prime Minister announced a new mandatory code of conduct for commercial tenancies, be they retail, industrial or office tenancies. The code sets out 14 good faith leasing principles that apply to small and medium-sized enterprises with a turnover of $50 million or less and that are eligible for the JobKeeper payment scheme. Of course, to be eligible for the JobKeeper payment scheme, a tenant's turnover must have declined by at least 30%. The language of the legislation incorporating the code is yet to be seen, but it is anticipated that the code will form a schedule to the existing state and territory leasing legislation, and that the code won't supersede the legislation, but its aim is to complement it and will inform the operation of the legislative provisions. I don't propose to go through each and every one of the 14 principles, but just the main ones that you should be across. For a full summary of the 14 principles, please do go to our website, www.conditsis.com. The first principle that I'd like to talk about is that landlords cannot terminate a tenant's lease for non-payment of rent during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and for a subsequent recovery period. The only issue with that is that there's no prescribed time frame. Does that mean the landlord can't terminate a lease for the next 6 months for non-payment of rent, or for a shorter period, or for a longer period? We just don't know yet. The second and third principles, which are interrelated, are that a landlord has to offer a rent waiver or deferral to a tenant in proportion to the loss of revenue by the tenant, and that at least 50% of that rent reduction has to be in the form of a rent waiver. I think this is probably the most difficult principle to get your head around, and it's probably the most controversial principle as well, because for landlords to offer a rent waiver, which is a complete abatement of the rent, landlords will not necessarily enjoy the same benefit from its own financier or lender. To best explain these two interrelated principles is by way of an example. If a tenant's turnover has declined by, say, 40%, then a landlord in theory could offer a rent reduction or a rent waiver, of the 40%, or it can offer a rent waiver of half of that, so 20%, and then the other 20% rent reduction can come in the form of a rent deferral. So on that note, any deferred rent can be paid within a 24-month period or until the end of the lease term, whichever is the greater period. So if a lease has, say, 6 months left to run, then a landlord has to offer the tenant an extension of that lease term to cover the period of that rent deferral. The other leasing principles to be across is that landlords cannot call upon the security bond or the bank guarantee for non-payment of rent. For any statutory charges that are reduced, that benefit has to be passed on to the tenant. So in New South Wales, there is talk of land tax being reduced by 25%. If that is the case, then that 25% reduction has to be passed on to the tenant on a proportionate basis. Any other benefits enjoyed by the landlord from their financier, say a deferral in their loan and principal repayments, again have to be passed on to the tenant. And finally, sometimes in leases there is a provision where a tenant is penalised for failing to trade or for failing to keep their doors open. So such a provision can't be enforced during this time by the landlord. It's important to note that the rationale behind this new code is not only to balance the commercial interests of landlords and tenants at this time, but also to ensure that when we do get to the other side of this pandemic crisis, that a landlord has a viable tenant in place that is able to meet its leasing obligations to the end of the term. So we wish you the very best of luck and take care.